An entire family of 5 vanished from their remote Alaskan cabin in 1996, living a reclusive off-grid life. For 10 years, the official story was that they had met with a tragic accident in the unforgiving wilderness, and the case went cold. It wasn't until a decade later that a man, considering buying the property, noticed maggots wriggling from the floorboards. This disturbing discovery would reveal the truth wasn't in the wild, but inside the cabin all along. The path leading into the Alaskan wilderness in late October 1996 was more of a suggestion of a road than an actual one. It was a narrow, winding corridor carved through dense spruce and birch, defined by deep ruts, exposed roots, and mud that was already beginning to freeze solid under a sky the color of bruised steel. Gwendolyn Waright gripped the steering wheel of her sturdy 4-wheel drive vehicle, her knuckles white as she navigated the treacherous terrain. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and the impending freeze. The landscape was muted and seemingly devoid of life. Gwendolyn was making her final trip of the season to the homestead of her son, Bastion Pasternac. This visit was a crucial, ritualistic check-in before the heavy snows arrived and isolated the family entirely until the spring thaw. Bastion, 37, his wife Vesper, 34, and their 3 children, Isadora, 10, Zara, 8, and Bram, 6, lived a life entirely disconnected from the grid. Their world was defined by the rhythms of the wilderness, centered around a rustic, self-built cabin of stone and wood miles from the nearest settlement. As Gwendolyn rounded the final bend and entered the familiar clearing, the first thing that struck her was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the deep woods, but an unsettling absence of activity. There was no smoke curling from the chimney, no sound of children playing, and no sign of Bastion chopping wood or working outside. The cabin stood solitary against the forest backdrop, looking less like a home and more like an abandoned structure. She parked her vehicle and stepped out, her boots crunching on the frost-hardened earth. The outdoor fire pit, usually a hub of activity, was cold, filled with nothing but charred logs and gray ash. She called out their names, her voice sounding small and brittle in the vastness of the clearing. There was no response. The silence felt heavy and oppressive. A sense of unease began to settle over her as she approached the cabin. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't entirely unusual. The Pasternacs had no neighbors and little fear of intruders in this remote location. Inside, the cabin presented a confusing tableau. It appeared orderly, almost too orderly. Winter supplies, dried meats, canned goods, and stacks of firewood were neatly stocked along the walls. Clothing was hung up. Dishes were clean and put away. It looked exactly as it should for a family preparing to hunker down for the long winter. They clearly intended to stay, but the family was gone, all 5 of them. Gwendolyn moved through the small rooms, checking the sleeping loft and the main living area. The beds were made. Vesper's sewing materials sat untouched on a small table. There were no signs of a struggle or a rushed departure. It was as if the family had simply ceased to exist. Returning outside, she conducted a wider sweep of the immediate property, the outhouse, the storage shed, and the perimeter of the clearing. It was then that she confirmed the most critical detail. The family's heavy-duty truck, their only motorized link to the outside world, and the only vehicle capable of reliably navigating the treacherous track out of the wilderness, was missing. This realization shifted her unease into sharp alarm. Without the truck, they couldn't have gone far. Yet, they were nowhere on the property. There was no note left on the kitchen table, no communication explaining where they might have gone or why. After a frantic hour searching the immediate woods and calling until her voice was hoarse, Gwendolyn realized she needed help. The isolation her son cherished now felt like a threat. She forced herself back into her vehicle and began the long, arduous journey back toward the nearest settlement. The drive was a blur of anxiety and disbelief. Upon reaching civilization, she immediately contacted the Alaska State Troopers and reported the entire Pasternac family missing. When asked for identification, she provided the troopers with a recent photograph. It showed the family of 5 smiling warmly in front of their cabin. Bastion stood tall in a plaid flannel shirt and a wide-brimmed hat. Vesper crouched beside him in her distinct coral shirt and mustard-yellow pants, and the 3 blonde children beamed between them near the gently smoldering campfire. It was a portrait of contented off-grid life, now in stark contrast to their sudden, inexplicable absence. The disappearance of an entire family in the Alaskan interior triggered an immediate response from the state troopers, but the nature of that response was heavily dictated by the environment itself. The Pasternac homestead was profoundly remote, situated in a landscape notorious for its unforgiving terrain and sudden, violent shifts in weather. In 1996, the logistical challenges of mounting a comprehensive search in such terrain were immense. When investigators factored in the late October timeline, the cusp of winter, and the critical detail that the family's only vehicle was missing, the investigation's focus immediately turned external. The prevailing theory took root almost instantly, driven by the statistics of survival in the bush. Authorities assumed the Pasternacs had attempted a late-season supply run or decided to head toward town before the heavy snows made the tracks impassable. Somewhere along that perilous route, investigators hypothesized they had encountered disaster. A vehicular accident on the treacherous terrain, a breakdown far from help, or becoming irretrievably stranded seemed the most plausible explanations. The rudimentary tracks were prone to washouts, sudden rockfalls, and treacherous mudslides. In the Alaskan wilderness, a simple mistake could quickly escalate into a fatal situation. Based on this assumption, a massive search and rescue operation was initiated. The scale of the search area was daunting, encompassing hundreds of square miles of dense forest, winding river valleys, and steep mountain passes. The Alaska State Troopers deployed helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft, their pilots flying low grids over the vast landscape. The air was filled with the rhythmic thud of rotor blades as searchers scanned the terrain below, looking for any sign of the missing truck, a glint of metal, tire tracks diverting from the path, or the remnants of a makeshift camp. The roar of the engines echoed over the valleys, a stark contrast to the profound silence Gwendolyn had encountered. On the ground, teams of volunteers and trained search and rescue personnel began the arduous task of checking the known routes and trails leading away from the homestead. They pushed through thick underbrush and navigated icy streams, their efforts hampered by the increasingly cold temperatures and shortening daylight hours. They battled the deteriorating weather conditions, with the mud freezing into iron-hard ruts and the first flurries of snow beginning to fall. The search was exhaustive in its scope, but it was entirely focused on finding a stranded family or the site of an accident. While the external search was underway, investigators did conduct an examination of the Pasternac cabin. However, their approach was shaped by the belief that the critical event had occurred elsewhere. They arrived at the homestead looking not for a crime scene, but for clues that might indicate the family's intended destination or state of mind before they departed. The examination of the cabin was cursory. Investigators walked through the rooms, documenting the scene as Gwendolyn had found it. They noted the stock supplies and the general orderliness of the living space. They saw no obvious signs of forced entry. The door had been unlocked when Gwendolyn arrived. There was no blood, no overturned furniture, and nothing to suggest a violent altercation had taken place inside the home. To the troopers, the scene appeared consistent with a family that had simply stepped out and failed to return. Because it was not classified as a crime scene, the cabin was not processed with forensic rigor. Investigators did not dust for fingerprints, collect trace evidence, or conduct a detailed structural examination. They checked the rooms, closets, and the immediate exterior, but did not venture into the more difficult-to-access areas. The shallow crawl space beneath the floorboards, accessible through panels in the flooring, was never inspected. The focus remained firmly on the wilderness outside. Gwendolyn Wainwright, however, vehemently objected to the direction of the investigation. Consumed by anxiety and frustration, she argued that the authorities were fundamentally misunderstanding her son and his capabilities. Bastion was not a reckless amateur. He was an expert survivalist, deeply attuned to the environment and meticulous in his planning. The idea that he would have driven his family into an obvious hazard this late in the season, or that he would be unable to survive if the truck broke down, seemed inconceivable to her. She pressed the investigators to look closer at the homestead and consider other possibilities beyond a simple accident, but her concerns were largely dismissed. Gwendolyn felt a growing sense of bitterness, convinced that the investigation was inadequate and colored by prejudice. She believed the troopers were lazy and unwilling to dedicate the necessary resources because the Pasternacs lived an unconventional off-grid lifestyle. In their eyes, she felt the family was just another group of dreamers who had been swallowed by the bush. The official stance seemed to be that those who chose to live in the wilderness were ultimately responsible for the risks they assumed. As the days turned into weeks, the weather deteriorated rapidly. The first heavy snows began to fall, blanketing the landscape and obscuring any potential clues. Temperatures plummeted, making survival in the open impossible. The extensive search efforts were reluctantly called off. The disappearance of Bastion, Vesper, Isadora, Zara, and Bram Pasternac was officially categorized as a likely tragic accident, a death by misadventure. With the official search concluded and the wilderness locked in ice, the case went cold, buried under the snow and the weight of official assumptions. Gwendolyn was left alone with her grief and unanswered questions. Refusing to accept that her family was gone forever, she took on the responsibility of maintaining the cabin. She made the arduous journey several times a year, ensuring the structure remained sound and the clearing maintained, clinging to the hope that one day they would return to the home they had built. The cabin became a silent vigil in the wilderness, a physical manifestation of her unresolved grief and her refusal to accept the official narrative. The Alaskan wilderness kept its secrets for a decade. From 1996 to 2006, there were no sightings of the Pasternac family, no trace of their missing truck, and no leads to follow. The case remained frozen in time, a file gathering dust in the cold case unit, a melancholy footnote in the history of the region. For Gwendolyn Wright, the decade had been a slow erosion of hope, marked by the relentless passage of seasons and the crushing weight of uncertainty. Maintaining the remote homestead had become an increasingly difficult burden. The journey was physically demanding, the physical labor of repairs exhausting, and the financial cost of upkeep was significant. But more than that, the emotional toll was devastating. The cabin, once a symbol of her son's dream and the center of her hope, had become a monument to a tragedy she couldn't define. In the summer of 2006, Gwendolyn finally reached a breaking point. Exhausted, aging, and needing closure, she made the painful decision to sell the property. She simply did not have the energy or resources to continue the vigil. The listing attracted a specific kind of buyer, individuals seeking extreme isolation and the challenge of living off the land. Among them was Arlo Finch, a man experienced in carpentry and remote construction, who saw potential in the Pasternac homestead. He was aware of the property's history, but his interest was pragmatic. He arranged to visit the property to conduct a thorough inspection of the cabin's structural integrity. Finch arrived on a bright July afternoon. The cabin, though showing signs of age and weathering, remained solid, a testament to Bastion's craftsmanship and Gwendolyn's upkeep. Finch began his inspection systematically, checking the stone foundation, the wooden walls, and the corrugated metal roof. He moved with the practiced eye of a builder, assessing the structure's strengths and weaknesses. He then moved inside, assessing the interior. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, the air inside still and musty, heavy with the scent of aged wood and dust. Finch methodically examined the floor joists and the wide wooden planks of the flooring, testing for rot or insect damage. He moved slowly, deliberately, documenting his findings. It was when he moved into a secluded corner of the main living area near where the wood stove stood that he noticed an anomaly. The flooring in this corner appeared slightly warped, the planks uneven, subtly different from the surrounding boards. There was a localized area of dark grime accumulated near the baseboard, which Finch initially attributed to water damage, mold, or years of accumulated dirt. He knelt down to get a closer look, running his hand over the rough surface of the wood, testing its resilience. As he shifted his weight, his eye caught a flicker of movement. Near the seam between the floor and the wall, a small white form wriggled against the dark wood. He leaned in closer, his focus narrowing. It was a single maggot. Finch paused, frowning. The presence of maggots inside a dwelling usually indicated decay, something decomposing nearby. He assumed a small animal, a mouse or a squirrel, had perhaps gotten trapped in the wall or under the floor and died. It was an unpleasant discovery, but not uncommon in rustic cabins. He decided to investigate the source to assess the extent of any potential damage. The planks in the corner were loose, designed to allow access to the crawl space below. Finch retrieved a pry bar from his toolkit and positioned it under the edge of the warped board. He applied pressure, and the old wood groaned in protest as the nails pulled free. The sound was sharp in the silence of the cabin that he lifted the floorboard, which was heavier than he expected. As he pulled it up and looked at the underside, the sight was jarring, a stark contrast to the cabin's tidy interior. A thick layer of dark, damp, decomposing matter coated the wood. Clinging to the grime were several maggots clustered together in the decay. The moment the plank was removed, the air in the cabin changed dramatically. A faint, unusual odor wafted up from the opening, a sickly sweet scent underlying the mustiness of the crawl space. It was a cloying smell Finch recognized instinctively: decomposition. Finch held the plank up to the light, inspecting the infestation. The grime wasn't just dirt or mold, it was the residue of decay. Using a thin stick from his pack, he pointed at the maggots, assessing the extent of the damage to the wood. The image was stark, his weathered hands holding the grimy plank, the stick pointing to the evidence of decay. He knew then that this wasn't a small animal. Concerned that he had uncovered something far more significant than a dead rodent, Finch peered into the opening in the floor. The crawl space was shallow and dark, with uneven earth below. The space was barely 2 feet high, cluttered with dust and debris. He retrieved a high-powered flashlight from his pack and shone the beam into the darkness. The light cut through the gloom, illuminating the cramped space beneath the cabin. At first, he saw only dirt and the rough underside of the floor joists. But as he swept the beam toward the corner, the light fell upon something that didn't belong. Partially concealed in the shadows and wrapped in what looked like old blankets or tarps, the shape was unmistakable. Finch felt a jolt of adrenaline and a sickening realization. The flashlight beam illuminated a human hand, the flesh desiccated and mummified. Further along, the shape resolved into the contours of a human torso and legs. Tucked into the farthest reaches of the crawl space were human remains. Finch recoiled from the opening, his heart pounding. He stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, and rushed out of the cabin, gasping for fresh air. The silence of the cabin now felt heavy and sinister. He quickly gathered his tools and left, securing the door behind him. He drove directly to the nearest Alaska State Trooper station. The journey was a blur of adrenaline and horror as he reported his gruesome discovery. The report mobilized an immediate response. Authorities descended on the remote homestead, treating it not as a missing person's location, but as a crime scene. A forensic team was dispatched to recover the remains. The cabin, which had been overlooked a decade earlier, was now the focal point of a major investigation. The recovery process was delicate and grueling. The confined space of the crawl space made extraction difficult, and the team had to remove several more sections of flooring to access the body. When the remains were finally brought out into the daylight, it was clear they had been there for a significant amount of time. The cold climate of the Alaskan interior, particularly the consistently low temperatures in the insulated crawl space, had significantly slowed decomposition. The unique microclimate had acted as a natural preservative, leaving the body largely preserved, though desiccated. The discovery shattered the long-held assumption that the Pasternac family had vanished in the wilderness. The mystery had turned inward, focused now on the cabin itself. The remains were transported to the state medical examiner's office for autopsy and identification. Through the comparison of dental records, authorities confirmed the body's identity. It was Vesper Pasternac, the mother of the missing family, found concealed beneath the floor of her own home. The critical questions now were, where were Bastion and the 3 children, and who was responsible for Vesper's death? The discovery of Vesper Pasternac's remains beneath the cabin floor instantly transformed the decade-old mystery into a homicide investigation. The narrative of a tragic accident, which had dictated the official response in 1996, evaporated. In its place was the grim reality that Vesper had been murdered and deliberately hidden within her own home. The case was officially reopened and assigned to the Alaska State Troopers Major Crimes Unit, signaling a new level of seriousness and resources. The responsibility for the investigation fell to Detective Daxon Hughes, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for meticulous attention to detail and a deep empathy for victims. Hughes approached the cold case with a sense of urgency that the initial investigation had sorely lacked. As a father himself, he was particularly troubled by the fate of the 3 missing children. He understood the profound implications of the discovery. If the mother was dead, the fate of the father and the children was now cast in a much darker light. The first priority was to determine the cause of Vesper's death. The state medical examiner conducted a detailed autopsy using the advanced forensic technology available in 2006. Despite the passage of 10 years, Vesper Pasternac had died from a single gunshot wound to the chest. The trajectory of the bullet and the nature of the wound indicated a close-range confrontation. The manner of death was unequivocally homicide. While the autopsy was underway, the forensic team continued to process the cabin, meticulously searching the crawl space where Vesper's body had been found. The area was treated as a primary crime scene. Every inch of the confined space was examined under high-intensity lights. It was during this detailed examination that they made a critical discovery. Concealed near where the body had lain, tucked into a recess in the stone foundation, and wrapped in a deteriorating oilcloth, investigators found a firearm. It was a hunting rifle, rusted and corroded from years in the damp environment, but still recognizable. The discovery of the murder weapon at the scene was a major breakthrough, providing a direct link between the victim and the perpetrator. The rifle was immediately transported to the state crime lab for analysis. The implications of this discovery were immediate and profound. Ballistics testing confirmed that the rifle was the weapon used to kill Vesper Pasternac. The trajectory and the impact matched the autopsy findings. More significantly, the serial number on the rifle, though partially obscured by rust, was traceable. The weapon was registered to Bastion Pasternac. The evidence seemed to paint a clear and damning picture. Vesper had been murdered in her home, killed with her husband's gun, and concealed beneath the floorboards. Bastion Pasternac and the 3 children, Isadora, Zara, and Bram, were still missing, along with the family truck. The logical conclusion was inescapable. Bastion had murdered his wife, hidden her body, and fled with the children. The focus of the investigation shifted dramatically. Bastion Pasternac, the presumed victim of a wilderness accident, became the prime suspect. The theory shifted from a general mystery to a specific scenario of domestic homicide and abduction. The motivation remained unclear. Perhaps a domestic dispute that escalated, the pressures of the isolated lifestyle finally breaking him, or a planned execution. But the evidence strongly suggested Bastion was responsible. Detective Hughes initiated a widespread manhunt for Bastion and the children. The search expanded beyond the Alaskan wilderness to encompass the entire North American continent. The children, if still alive, would now be young adults. Isadora would be 20, Zara 18, and Bram 16. Hughes disseminated age-progressed images and alerts across the United States and Canada, focusing on communities known for off-grid living or anonymity, places where Bastion might be able to blend in and avoid detection. The search was complicated by the passage of time and the possibility that Bastion might be using aliases. As the manhunt mobilized, Hughes turned his attention to understanding the Pasternac family's background, looking for any clues that might explain the murder's motive. He conducted a lengthy interview with Gwendolyn Wainwright. Gwendolyn, devastated by the confirmation of Vesper's death and the suspicion now cast upon her son, vehemently defended Bastion. She insisted he was a devoted husband and father, incapable of such violence. She reiterated her frustration with the initial investigation, arguing that authorities were once again rushing to judgment, focusing on the easy explanation rather than the complex reality. During the interview, Gwendolyn revealed details about the family's life that had been previously overlooked or deemed irrelevant. She described the challenges they faced living off-grid, but also the deep connection they had to the land. But then she mentioned something specific that caught Hughes's attention, a detail that seemed inconsistent with the narrative of a sudden violent outburst. She revealed that in the months leading up to the disappearance, her youngest grandson, Bram, had been suffering from unexplained chronic illnesses. The 6-year-old boy had experienced severe lethargy, persistent skin rashes, and debilitating digestive issues. The symptoms were alarming, baffling the family and the local doctors they consulted during their rare trips to town. Gwendolyn explained that Bastion had become intensely focused, almost obsessed, with their environment. He was convinced that something in the land or the water was making his son sick and believed they were being poisoned. She described how Bastion had begun meticulously testing their well water and the soil around the homestead. He had collected samples, conducted rudimentary tests, and documented his findings in detailed notebooks. He was attempting to identify the source of the contamination, convinced that it was the key to saving his son. His behavior, Gwendolyn insisted, was not that of a man descending into madness, but that of a desperate father trying to protect his family from an unseen threat. Hughes listened patiently, noting the details. At this stage of the investigation, the information seemed peripheral. Perhaps it was the paranoid delusions of a man living in extreme isolation, or a desperate mother trying to deflect suspicion from her son. The physical evidence, the body, the rifle, the disappearance, strongly pointed toward Bastion. However, Hughes filed the information away, aware that in a case this complex and cold, no detail could be entirely dismissed. The mystery of Bram's illness and Bastion's poison theory remained an unresolved thread. For now, the focus remained on finding Bastion Pasternac and the missing children. But Hughes recognized that the truth might be far more complicated than the evidence suggested. While the nationwide manhunt for Bastion Pasternac continued to yield nothing but dead ends, Detective Hughes found himself increasingly drawn to the details Gwendolyn Wainwright had provided about her son's preoccupation with environmental contamination. The image of Bastion as a cold-blooded killer didn't align with the portrait painted by his mother, a devoted father desperate to understand his son's mysterious illness. If Bastion truly believed his family was being poisoned, it added a layer of complexity to the case that the simple domestic homicide theory didn't account for. It suggested a motive that went beyond domestic strife, a motive rooted in fear and paranoia, or perhaps a genuine external threat. In a series of follow-up interviews, Hughes pressed Gwendolyn for more specifics about Bastion's investigations. He needed something tangible, something beyond the anecdotal accounts of Bastion's anxieties. It was then that Gwendolyn revealed a critical detail that had seemed insignificant at the time, a desperate attempt by Bastion to seek help from the outside world. Bastion had mentioned that he was compiling his findings and the environmental samples he had collected, intending to send them to someone who could expose the truth. He had identified an investigative journalist known for covering environmental issues and had mailed a package shortly before the disappearance. This revelation provided Hughes with the first tangible lead outside the immediate circumstances of the crime scene. If he could locate the journalist and retrieve the package, he might gain insight into Bastion's state of mind and the reality of the threat he perceived. It was a long shot, a fragile thread connecting the present to the events of a decade prior, but it was the only lead they had. The search for the journalist began. Gwendolyn could not recall the name, only that he worked for a major newspaper in the lower 48, specializing in environmental reporting. Hughes began the painstaking process of cross-referencing journalists active in 1996, reviewing archives and making discreet inquiries. After weeks of research and numerous phone calls, he identified a likely candidate, Roland Jessup. Jessup had been a prominent investigative reporter, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, known for his tenacity and his willingness to tackle controversial subjects. But he had abruptly retired several years earlier, seemingly vanishing from the public eye. Hughes tracked him down to a small, isolated town in the Pacific Northwest, where he was living a reclusive life far removed from the world of journalism. Hughes decided that a phone call would not suffice. He needed to meet Jessup in person to assess his credibility and convince him to cooperate. He flew out to the town and located Jessup's home, a modest cabin nestled in the woods, eerily reminiscent of the Pasternac homestead. The meeting was tense. The retired journalist was initially reluctant to speak, appearing guarded, anxious, and dismissive of Hughes's inquiries. He seemed haunted by something, a shadow lurking beneath the surface of his carefully constructed solitude. But when Hughes explained the circumstances, the discovery of Vesper's body, the missing children, and the mention of the package sent by Bastion Pasternac, Jessup's demeanor changed. The guardedness gave way to a profound sadness and fear. In a tense conversation that lasted several hours, Jessup confirmed that he had indeed received the package in 1996. It contained detailed letters from Bastion describing his son's illness in agonizing detail, his findings regarding the contamination of his land, and samples of water and soil collected from the well and the surrounding area. Jessup had been intrigued by the story. The details provided by Bastion were compelling, suggesting a serious environmental issue. He had begun initial investigations, planning to have the samples analyzed and to travel to Alaska to meet the family. However, shortly after he started making inquiries, the situation turned sinister. Jessup revealed that he had received anonymous, menacing threats. They were not vague warnings, but specific, credible threats against his family. The callers knew details about his life, his children's routines, the schools they attended, and made it clear that if he pursued the story, there would be devastating consequences. The threats were sophisticated, indicating a level of surveillance that terrified him. Terrified, Jessup had immediately dropped the investigation. He never published the story and never contacted Bastion again. For over a decade, the decision had haunted him, contributing to his early retirement and his retreat from the world. Yet, driven by guilt and professional responsibility, he couldn't bring himself to destroy the evidence. Secretly, he had kept Bastion's letters and the original samples, storing them in a secure location where they had remained untouched. Hughes immediately understood the profound implications of Jessup's account. If someone had gone to such lengths to silence a journalist, Bastion's claims of poisoning were likely a real and dangerous discovery, not just paranoid delusions. The conspiracy was far larger than Hughes had ever imagined, involving individuals capable of violence and intimidation. Hughes retrieved the evidence and, under tight security, sent the package to a specialized laboratory for analysis using the advanced forensic technology available in 2007. The results were alarming. The soil and water samples contained dangerously high concentrations of heavy metals like lead, mercury, and arsenic. More significantly, the analysis also identified specialized chemical compounds, specific solvents not found in nature. The discovery validated Bastion's claims and shifted the focus of the investigation once more. The Pasternac land had been poisoned. The motive for the family's murder might not have been a domestic dispute, but an attempt to cover up the contamination and silence the family who had discovered the truth. The lab identified the chemicals as types commonly used in industrial extraction processes. Hughes began investigating potential sources of the contamination, with the primary suspect being Alaska Petrox, a major oil and gas company with operations about 50 miles away. The possibility of illegal dumping, a common practice in remote regions to avoid disposal costs, became the main focus. Hughes launched an aggressive investigation into the corporation, suspecting corporate negligence and a massive cover-up. For several months, the investigation consumed his life, involving subpoenas for records, employee interviews, and environmental surveys. The corporation was uncooperative and defensive, only fueling Hughes's suspicions. The case seemed on the verge of a major breakthrough, a classic case of corporate greed and environmental negligence. However, after a thorough investigation, Alaska Petrox was cleared of any wrongdoing. The crucial breakthrough came when the lab refined its analysis of the chemical compounds. They were not commercial solvents, but specialized military-grade chemicals with a specific formulation used almost exclusively by the military. Hydrological surveys also confirmed the contamination was localized to the Pasternac property and hadn't migrated from the company's operations. The investigation hit a dead end. The source of the contamination was unknown, and the connection to the military only deepened the mystery, opening a new, more sinister avenue of investigation. The failed corporate lead caused a backlash within the investigation team. Some investigators began to doubt the validity of Gwendolyn's claims and the contamination theory. They argued that Gwendolyn, as Bastion's mother, might be protecting him and intentionally misleading the investigation. Suspicion reverted to the original theory. Bastion was the killer, and the poisoning claims were either fabricated or irrelevant. Hughes, however, remained convinced that the contamination was the key to the case, even if the source remained elusive. The investigation stalled, caught between conflicting theories and a lack of concrete evidence, with the truth buried as deep as the toxins in the Alaskan soil. By the spring of 2007, the investigation into the Pasternac family's disappearance had once again come to a halt. The promising lead with Alaska Petrox had dissolved, leaving Detective Hughes with validated evidence of severe environmental contamination, but no identifiable source. The specialized nature of the military-grade solvents was a puzzling anomaly, a clue pointing to something far more complex and organized than illegal dumping. Yet, it led nowhere concrete. The bureaucratic labyrinth of military operations made tracing the chemicals a daunting task fraught with secrecy and resistance. Pressure mounted on Hughes from his superiors to abandon the environmental angle and refocus the investigation on the manhunt for Bastion Pasternac. The circumstantial evidence against Bastion was compelling. His wife murdered with his gun, concealed in their home, while he and the children were missing. The prevailing opinion within the department was that the poisoning narrative was a distraction, perhaps a manifestation of Bastion's own paranoid delusions that had ultimately driven him to violence. Hughes found himself increasingly isolated, fighting a battle on two fronts, against the unknown perpetrators of the contamination and against the skepticism of his own colleagues. Then, a sudden breakthrough occurred, one that seemed to confirm the dominant theory and provide the definitive closure the department craved. A team of forestry workers conducting an aerial survey in a remote, rugged area of the wilderness, about 80 miles from the Pasternac cabin, reported spotting wreckage at the bottom of a deep ravine. The area was treacherous, rarely accessed, and the wreckage had been concealed by the dense forest canopy until the recent survey provided a clear line of sight. The description of the wreckage matched the Pasternac family truck, the vehicle that had been missing for over a decade. The discovery mobilized a massive response. The location was so remote and the terrain so difficult that a complex retrieval operation was required. Heavy lift helicopters and specialized equipment were deployed to access the ravine. The dangerous operation took several days and was intensely covered by the media, which reignited public interest and seemingly validated the original assumption of a wilderness tragedy. When the crushed and rusted hulk of the truck was finally retrieved and transported to a secure facility, investigators began the painstaking process of analysis. The discovery seemed to provide the final pieces of the puzzle, a grim tableau telling the story of the family's final moments. Inside the truck's cab, investigators found evidence that powerfully redirected the narrative back onto Bastion. They discovered another rifle registered to Bastion, which had been missing from the cabin inventory, suggesting he was armed when he fled. More intriguingly, there was a watertight container, seemingly protected from the elements, holding a small amount of the toxic chemicals identical to those found on the Pasternac land. This discovery appeared to explain the contamination issue. Bastion had been handling the chemicals himself, perhaps involved in some illicit activity, and had accidentally poisoned his son, Bram. More significantly, clothing belonging to the 3 children, Isadora, Zara, and Bram, was found scattered within the wreckage. No human remains were found, but the presence of the clothing suggested they had been in the truck at the time of the crash. The evidence seemed to corroborate a tragic scenario. Bastion, perhaps driven mad by guilt over accidentally poisoning his son, or simply unstable, had murdered Vesper, hid her body, and then fled with the children. Overwhelmed by his actions and the hopelessness of his situation, he had driven the truck off the cliff, killing himself and the children in a final act of desperation. The absence of remains was attributed to the severity of the impact and the scattering of remains by scavengers over the decade. For the department, the case seemed solved. The discovery of the truck and the evidence within it provided a neat resolution to the decade-old mystery. The narrative of a murder-suicide driven by the pressures of off-grid living and an accidental poisoning was compelling and seemed supported by the evidence. The department prepared to close the case. Detective Hughes, however, found the discovery deeply unsettling. While the evidence seemed to fit the narrative, the circumstances of the discovery felt too convenient, too perfectly timed. After months of investigation leading nowhere, the sudden appearance of the truck containing exactly the evidence needed to implicate Bastion and absolve the unknown poisoner struck him as highly suspicious. It was a narrative that tied up all the loose ends, confirmed the prevailing theory, and buried the truth about the contamination. He began a meticulous review of the crash site analysis and the forensic examination of the truck. He focused on the physics of the crash, the vehicle's trajectory, and the impact damage. What he found contradicted the official narrative. The damage was not consistent with a vehicle that had been driven off the cliff at high speed. The crush pattern suggested a lower velocity impact, more consistent with a vehicle that had been pushed or rolled off the edge. The pattern of deformation did not align with the physics of a freefall. Furthermore, the analysis of the terrain at the top of the ravine, preserved in the hardened earth, indicated that the truck had been stationary before it went over the edge. There were no signs of acceleration or braking, no skid marks indicating a vehicle traveling at speed. Hughes concluded that the truck had not been driven off the cliff, it had been pushed. The crash was not an accident or a suicide. It was staged. Hughes became convinced that the truck had been intentionally placed in the ravine, perhaps moved from another location where it had been concealed for the past decade. The evidence, the rifle, the chemicals, and the children's clothing, had been deliberately planted to implicate Bastion and shut down the inquiry into the poisoning. This realization suggested a sophisticated adversary, someone with the resources and motivation to orchestrate such an elaborate cover-up, someone who was actively monitoring the investigation and manipulating it from the shadows. If the crash was staged, it meant that Bastion Pasternac was likely not the perpetrator but another victim, and it meant that the true killers were still out there, organized, ruthless, and capable of operating with impunity in the vastness of the Alaskan wilderness. The mystery deepened, pointing toward a conspiracy far more sinister than a domestic homicide. Hughes realized the danger he was in. He kept his suspicions quiet, aware that if he was right, he was now investigating not just a murder, but a sophisticated cover-up that might involve powerful interests that had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secrets. Detective Hughes, now operating almost entirely on his own intuition and against the prevailing consensus of his department, knew that the key to the case lay not in the staged accident, but in the origin of the military-grade solvents. The presence of those chemicals on the Pasternac land and the sophisticated effort to frame Bastion pointed toward an organization with significant resources and a desperate need to protect a lucrative secret. The staged crash was a clear indication that the forces behind the poisoning were not only aware of the investigation, but were actively manipulating it. He decided to focus his investigation entirely on the source of the toxins. The specialized nature of the solvents suggested a military origin, a realization that narrowed the scope of the inquiry but significantly raised the stakes. Hughes began the arduous task of tracing the chemical signatures back to their point of manufacture and distribution. He cross-referenced the compounds with military procurement records from the mid-1990s, a task complicated by bureaucracy and classified information. He had to bypass standard channels, using contacts within the Military Logistics Command to access the data he needed, working discreetly to avoid alerting the conspirators. His investigation focused on military bases located within a several hundred-mile radius of the Pasternac homestead. He analyzed the disposal manifests for hazardous materials, looking for any anomalies or discrepancies that might indicate illegal dumping. It was a tedious process involving the review of thousands of documents, a forensic accounting exercise that required meticulous attention to detail. After weeks of exhaustive research, he found it. A massive discrepancy in the disposal manifests from a nearby military base dated 1996. The record showed a contract worth $3.4 million for the disposal of a large quantity of hazardous materials, including the specific solvents found on the Pasternac land. The contract indicated that the materials had been transported to a specialized disposal facility in the lower 48, and the job had been signed off as completed. The paperwork was impeccable, seemingly legitimate. However, when Hughes contacted the designated disposal facility, their records showed no evidence of the materials ever arriving. The chain of custody was broken. The $3.4 million had been paid out, but the hazardous waste had vanished. The discovery confirmed Hughes's suspicion of a conspiracy. The military waste had been illegally dumped in the Alaskan wilderness, and the disposal fee had been embezzled. The contamination of the Pasternac land was not accidental, but the result of a calculated criminal enterprise. Hughes now had a motive for the murders. Bastion Pasternac had discovered the illegal dumping operation, and his attempts to expose it, culminating in the package sent to Roland Jessup, had cost him and his family their lives. He focused on identifying the individuals responsible for the embezzlement scheme. He traced the authorization for the disposal contract and the oversight of the operation, identifying the 3 officers who had orchestrated the scheme and pocketed the funds. Colonel Cyrus Brick, the ringleader, Major Turan Forrester, the logistics officer who had falsified the manifests, and Captain Ephraim Lynch, who had overseen the physical dumping. These were not low-level operatives, but high-ranking officers with significant influence, respected figures within the military and the community. All 3 were still active in the military, or had moved into lucrative private sector positions, leveraging their connections and stolen wealth. Their careers were built on a foundation of corruption and murder. Hughes realized the danger he was in. He was investigating powerful men with a history of violence and the resources to cover their tracks. He began investigating the officers discreetly, gathering evidence of their financial activities and their movements in 1996. He placed them under surveillance, monitoring their communications and looking for any sign of panic. As Hughes began closing in, the conspirators realized that their cover-up was failing. The recent staging of the truck intended to close the case had instead reinvigorated the investigation. Recognizing Detective Hughes was closing in on the truth, they decided to escalate their efforts, targeting the one person who kept the case alive for a decade, Gwendolyn Wainwright. Hughes, who had been in regular contact with Gwendolyn, updating her on the investigation and ensuring her safety, couldn't reach her. He called repeatedly, but each time, the phone went unanswered. A sense of dread settled over him. Gwendolyn always picked up. He drove to her home, a small house on the outskirts of town, and found the front door forced open and the lock shattered. Inside, the signs of a struggle were clear: overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and a broken lamp. Gwendolyn was gone. The kidnapping galvanized Hughes. The conspiracy was no longer a cold case, it was an active threat. The conspirators had made a desperate move to silence the last remaining witness, and perhaps use her as leverage. Hughes immediately mobilized a tactical response, realizing he had a narrow window of opportunity to save her. He initiated emergency tracking and financial surveillance on the 3 suspects, focusing on any unusual movements. He tracked their cell phone usage and credit card transactions, and the surveillance paid off. Hughes tracked Forrester and Lynch to a remote industrial area outside Anchorage, where they had rented a warehouse using a shell corporation, an isolated and secure location, perfect for holding a hostage or carrying out an execution. He was convinced Gwendolyn was there. Hughes assembled a tactical team, briefing them on the situation. They were dealing with highly trained, armed, and dangerous military personnel. The raid had to be executed with speed and precision, with the priority being Gwendolyn's safe rescue. The team descended on the warehouse in the pre-dawn hours. The area was deserted, and the silence was broken only by the distant hum of industrial activity. The team established a perimeter, cutting off any escape routes. The atmosphere was tense, the silence heavy with anticipation. Hughes gave the order, and the team executed a dynamic entry, blowing the locks and storming the building. The sound of shattering glass and stun grenades echoed through the industrial park. The warehouse was vast and dimly lit, cluttered with crates and machinery. The team moved systematically, their movements swift and coordinated, clearing sections and searching for Gwendolyn and the suspects. They found them in a small office at the back. Forrester and Lynch were there, armed and holding Gwendolyn hostage. She was bound and gagged, terrified but alive. A tense standoff ensued as the suspects, realizing they were trapped, initially refused to surrender. Hughes negotiated with them, trying to de-escalate the situation and secure Gwendolyn's release. But Forrester and Lynch were desperate, their freedom hanging in the balance. The standoff shattered when Forrester made a threatening move toward Gwendolyn. The tactical team responded instantly, and a brief, violent confrontation erupted. They quickly subdued the suspects, neutralizing the threat and securing their arrest. Though terrified, Gwendolyn was physically unharmed. She was rescued and taken to safety. Simultaneously, another tactical team raided Colonel Broderick's residence. He was arrested without incident, caught completely off guard. The conspiracy was shattered, and the decade-long cover-up was finally unraveling. The truth about the Pasternac family's disappearance was about to be exposed. With the three conspirators in custody and Gwendolyn safe, the investigation moved quickly toward its conclusion. The evidence against Colonel Broderick, Major Forrester, and Captain Lynch was overwhelming, combining financial records of the embezzlement scheme with evidence of the murders and the recent kidnapping. The facade of respectability they had maintained for over a decade crumbled under the weight of their crimes. Under intense interrogation, Captain Ephraim Lynch, the lowest-ranking officer and the most vulnerable to pressure, confessed to the entire scheme. His confession detailed the intricate planning of the illegal dumping operation and the subsequent murders. The motive was simple greed, a desire for the $3.4 million disposal fee that superseded any sense of duty or morality. Lynch confirmed they had illegally dumped military waste in a remote area of the Alaskan wilderness, choosing a location so isolated that discovery seemed impossible. They didn't realize the toxic waste would leach into the groundwater, contaminating the Pasternac homestead downstream and poisoning young Bram. In the fall of 1996, however, their operation was compromised when Bastion Pasternac, while hunting, stumbled upon their active dumping site. He witnessed them unloading barrels of hazardous waste and realized the source of his son's illness. The conspirators knew they had to silence him. They captured Bastion on the spot, murdering him with brutal and cold efficiency. They buried his body near the dump site in a location so remote and contaminated they believed it would never be found. Despite extensive searches based on Lynch's confession, Bastion's body was later deemed unrecoverable, lost to the wilderness and hazardous conditions. To cover their tracks, they used their military connections to locate Bastion's cabin. They realized his family would soon realize he was missing, potentially leading investigators to the dump site. They devised a sinister plan to eliminate the entire family and frame Bastion for the murders, ensuring any investigation would focus on him. That night, they descended on the cabin. They retrieved Bastion's hunting rifle and confronted Vesper, murdering her with the weapon, a calculated act designed to implicate him. They hid her body and the rifle in the crawl space, knowing the cold environment would preserve the evidence. They then abducted the three children, Isadora, Zara, and Bram, who had witnessed their mother's murder. They took the family truck, creating the illusion that Bastion had fled with the children. The children, deemed expendable, were also eliminated. Lynch confessed they had murdered them shortly after the abduction. The confession led to the final, devastating discovery. Lynch led authorities to the remote, heavily contaminated dump site. The area was a wasteland littered with rusted barrels of chemical waste leaking toxins into the soil and water. The vegetation was stunted and discolored, a testament to the toxicity that had leached into the soil. Buried in a shallow grave near the hidden barrels, investigators recovered the remains of the 3 Pasternac children. Isadora, Zara, and Bram, victims of a greed-fueled conspiracy, were finally found. The recovery was a somber and emotional event, confirming the horrific fate of the entire family. Colonel Cyrus Broderick, Major Terence Forrester, and Captain Ephraim Lynch were charged and convicted of the murders and massive fraud. Throughout the trial, they showed no remorse, maintaining a defiant silence. They were sentenced to life in prison without parole. Gwendolyn Wright finally had the horrific answers she had sought for over a decade. The resolution brought no peace, only profound grief. Her entire family had been destroyed, victims not of the wilderness they cherished, but of systemic corruption and the unimaginable greed of 3 men who valued money over human life. The wilderness had not claimed them, human depravity had.